belongs to the third family, which is iconographic kind of expression. Next. Also, the metaphor is based on the certain memory of our own, at the same time, certain potential in which we create our own association. Around this time, when my imagination escaped from constellation on unicellular environment, I became rather interested in the area which is more related to our way of thinking or meaning itself. And this is one of the trial I have proposed to myself, more or less. That is copying the notation which psychosurgery or brain surgeons use under the name of EEG, electroencephalogram. Maybe I thought perhaps we could use the same scoring to search for the source of each metaphor into a certain visual effect. Next. This is from some of these, based on the two buildings you have seen. Next. 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 Now, for the stage, I'd like to bring up the my inclination, which is still lasting vigorously in me, that is concerned with time perception. Next. My analogical search for meaning became more sort of condensed on our brain activity itself at this stage. Actually, through the centuries, it seems to me, architects has to have certain analogical text in order to stipulate his own imagination. And I'm not exception of this. Next. However, my analogy, as far as I consider architecture is media based on certain communication, my analogy is directly come to the brain itself. As you see on your left, we are told that brain structure has three sort of chamber as a structural effect. And the one on the top is called a neocortex, which at the lower stage is very small. And as the evolution grows, I think it came so big that it wrapped the other part of the brain, like a meso or a paleocortex. And by doing this, we gained a certain power, which is the perception of sign and the time. However, we do have certain emotional reaction still remaining on the rest of the part. While the third chamber, which has grown on the level of a human being, correspond to a certain logical reaction. In other words, architectural thinking, we try to depend on that upper part, which is neocortex. However, the reaction to what we make are mostly done by the rest of the part. And in any case, one of the privilege we have is to be very sensitive to time perception itself. In terms of space perception, I think it's not only human privilege. For instance, if we see nesting of other animals, sometimes they do better job than we do. However, this is also the knowledge I have got recently is, this is sort of a recent theory to consider instead of evolutionary like we did on your left, to see the brain more spatially, saying that the right wing is more related to emotion, while the left is more sensitive to logics. However, one doctor in Japan has been doing certain tests. That is to let the Japanese people, some testy, listen to birds singing, whether how they respond to that. According to him, his theory, I think he says right chamber is music brain, while left is a language. However, most of the Japanese receive the birds singing on your left, that is linguistic or language brain. And very often it's for them it's so easy to switch between two, right and left functioning. In other words, this sort of switching ability may have created something to do with this perspective, time perception. Next. After the Japanese traditional painting, or the perspective appeared in the painting, so many times it has been pointed out the peculiarity of that perspective, which is close to isometric. Next. Doesn't have subjective eye point fixed. Next. In other words, the eye point of the subject floats in the air, keep moving around the object which he observes. Next. Next. That is more so compared with, for instance, Renaissance perspective, which is visually very stable, with observer's eye point is always determined. Next. Also, we do have multiple statements like we see here, having multiple expression onto one form. In other words, multiple-faced God. A certain superimposed expression happening within the same organism. Next. Next. Not only the facial expression, but also the expression appeared on the hand or behavior language. And there have been so many interpretations or searching on this effect. But my interest is to convert this sort of expression into the certain root of time sensibility or of time perception. Next, please. Not only visual effect. Next. Also in literature, as you have perhaps noticed, that the Japanese language as a linguistic statement, very often we skip or we are allowed to omit the subject and just stating the object, the meaning could be achieved. In other words, as we have seen in the visual statement, in the linguistic communication, subject flows always around the subject from time to time. And maybe this is something to do with what's happening in the environment as a phenomena today as heterogeneous kind of elements. Next. how do I cope with this sort of my own interpretation has been my sort of part of my ideation so far. And I have proposed some kind of conceptual drawings. Next. But best is to show in the practical work how to bring up the peculiar time perception into the spatial organization. Next. And this is the three-family house. The owner of the house owns lumbering company. And he owned also the site next to the house. And his wish is to provide certain prototype using which he can develop this joining site in the future. Next. Next. Except sort of a mini infrastructure which is built on the site, the black painted boxes are all provided in a factory nearby and carried to the site, which contains small scale rooms for kids or bedrooms and other facilities. Next. 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 When we did the project, we made certain future plan for sort of collective housing. My intent was to provide or to determine the certain things in advance, but not thoroughly, by leaving certain possibility for inhabitants to do by themselves. Next. Next. Components which each inhabitant owned follow to the certain rule, but it's all up to them how to modify each option as I like. Next. In other words, architect's wish doesn't cover to this extent, but this is sort of activity landscape which inhabitants create by themselves. However, we have to provide certain things which is perhaps invisible to some extent, or that is what I call relation between the expression and the contents. Next. Next. So as a phenomena, the whole place will become kind of quite heterogeneous environment by appearance. However, that heterogeneity in this case, to my expectation, is self-created or self-helped, because that corresponds to each inhabitant's time perception as their each individual demand goes by. Next. Now, to finish up my talk tonight, I'd like to introduce my own workshop in the north of Japan, in which also I did some experiment related to the idea or ideation of my own, that is to do something with time perception. Next. The city of Sapporo was laid out by the American farmers' help back late 19th century. And therefore the city streets are well grid island, and the site is facing to one of these. Next. Because we did work all by hands, the craftsmanship are not so well done in this case. Next. Just having a sort of universal space on the ground floor, which could be used for any sort of activity I like, and on the top of roof, I made a kind of kinetic space. Next. We utilize the basement too, not only for heating device, also for dark room and that kind of activities. Next. Next. Most of the time we use as an office, but each booth is easy to move because there is a certain trick on the bottom. It's easy to slide on the floor and store everything into the storage behind that white wall, which is also movable wall. So every now and then, especially weekend, we do have kind of workshop, inviting artists or different designers, or kind of meeting or seminars. Next. 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 On the top of the roof, basic structure was done by reinforced concrete. Therefore, it was easy to have flat roof. And on the top of the roof, although it is still experimental stage, I made 8 cubes sitting on 8 by 8 by 8. And each box could play different form according to what's happening inside. Next. However, during winter time, as most of other animal being in this vicinity, box close the play of forms and became a cube, large cube, and like other animals, hibernate all through the winter. Next. 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 Well, as the meaning of architecture increased, its sort of multi-balance or heterological kind of meaning, then we have to find out how to relate expression to the content in much broader sense. And along this challenge, I may keep going my own creation from now on. Next, please. Next. Next. Well, thank you very much. This is all for tonight.
introduce the attitudes of masonry from an architect's point of view. And Dan is really one of the most outstanding architects in the Southern California area. And the firm has done some of the most excellent masonry work in this area, plus I'm sure some of the Middle West that I don't know about. And he's won many awards. And I really feel happy that Dan is going to take time from his busy schedule to come this morning and talk to you on masonry. Then he will be followed by Walt Dickey of the Masonry Institute, who came with Jim Powers, who originally was going to talk, and then Jim said, well, you brought Walt because he had the notes, but he had all the notes in his head, so Jim's going to sit down while Walt does the talking. So that's the way we're going. And Dan, why don't you start?
Okay. I brought a lot of goodies here with me, so we'll refer to those, and also some slides of buildings we've worked on. It's a good chance to show you some of our work. But much of it relates to, okay. Much of it relates to masonry. I've always, as Ray said, been interested in masonry. I feel it's one of the prime building materials, a material that that has human qualities because of its scale, the fact that it is made originally made by hand, and but it is scaled to the human hands, to the tactile quality that many other materials today do not portray. I've got a number of samples here which indicate the various types of masonry materials that that are being used today. Of course, masonry is basically made out of clay or shale and also concrete. And there are three different methods of producing a brick. The first is a stiff clay or stiff mud material. The second is a wet mud material. And the third is a dry press type of material. Most of the brick that we use is of a stiff mud and extruded. This is a typical face brick, Pacific Clay Products material. It's made in the Los Angeles area. This is a Norman brick. I'll show you examples in the work that we have done using some of this material. This is a what's called a common brick, although it's a very hard brick in the Los Angeles area, structurally sound brick. This is a brick that has been flashed. The basic color of the brick is as you see it here, and the flashing technique is a matter of applying smoke to the brick when it's in the kiln. This is another example of that flash brick with just a darker tone to it. Of course, this is a concrete block sample, which you're probably familiar with the flat surfaces, typically in the forms, and then surfaces where you break the surface and expose the aggregate. And then in the dry press category, we have materials, terracotta material that's used as the backing for tile, which you see here, either glazed or unglazed. And here's a very dense extruded material, a paving material that's extruded in long ribbons and cut. The cutting process used for most brick is a wire cut system that exposes a texture that relates to the way that it is cut. A great deal of the brick that's used in Southern California and elsewhere has a superimposed texture on the face, which I don't really like. I feel that the surface of the material should really express the way it's constructed. Just as the wall, the finished wall, expresses the method, the scale and the type of material used and the way it is laid up. In a sense, I remember in a philosophy course that I took, the professor referred to Einfühlen, which is the feeling that you see in a painting or a sculpture, the method used to produce that painting. For instance, in Van Gogh's work, you look at the brush strokes on the painting, and you can picture the motion of his arm, the movement, the rapid movement of producing that painting. And just as when you hear music and a pianist playing, you hear the tones, but part of the aesthetic response is the way you are picturing his hand movements, his arm movements, his whole body movements in producing the sound. In the case of materials such as this, this concept relates to the surface, the quality of the material, as well as to the finished product, the brick wall. The brick wall relates to the human being placing one brick after another, and this is part of the aesthetic response that you get in viewing masonry work. In the kiln, there are, as I said, there are various finishes that can be achieved. Basically, three of the finishes are the natural clay surface. The second finish is a salt glaze finish, which is achieved by introducing salts into the kiln as it's being fired, and this produces a very hard surface, a vitrified type of surface that does not allow water to penetrate, and it's very durable. And then the third method is actually to apply a glaze in powder form onto the brick, which then melts and becomes a vitrified glass surface, as indicated on this particular tile. I think at this point I'd like to start showing the slides, and feel free to ask any questions about the slides or about the material specifically. Yes. Now, some of these buildings are not specifically all brick, but each one has brickwork in the composition. This is basically a concrete building. Here again, the same concepts. Did you want to? Oh. Yeah. The same concepts are involved. The texture of the concrete expressing the materials that were used to form the concrete, and also relating to the human scale. And I think this is important. As we get into more and more mechanized systems, we're tending to lose that human scale, and I guess I personally like to work within the more traditional methods of construction, because it tends to retain the human in the construction process. This is the CBS building at Studio Center. It's an office building with theaters on the ground floor. Here the basic structure is is concrete, and we used brick to enclose the ground floor theater area. There's 4 theaters on this level. as well as the paving material that surrounds the building and penetrates into the lobby area. This is a view at the back of the building. The brick here was produced by Hancock Brick Company, which unfortunately has gone out of business. They produced a very fine brick to meet your specifications, a custom brick, and they were very sensitive to the colors that were producible in Southern California. Unfortunately, and I have a gripe with the brick industry here in Southern California, that the available brick comes in atrocious colors, basically. There are so many bricks available in this country of very subtle colors, grays and browns and different types of finishes, yet Southern California has not really penetrated into this this kind of market. I have samples here of the Pacific Clay products, and they have expanded a little on the variety of brick, but you get into the sort of yellowish white, and then you get into the peach color, or the, I don't know what, that's not peach, but it's yellowish peach, and then the rose color. I personally don't like this type of color. I think it doesn't relate to the natural colors around it, the grass, the soil, and so forth, the blue sky. Also, there's prevalent finishes in Southern California, a brushed finish, which is a superimposed finish, which I feel destroys the quality of the brick surface. The ruffled surface is the standard surface, and there again, it's an attempt to create a brushed appearance. The assumption is that the natural clay is not attractive enough in its natural form, therefore you have to do something to the surface to decorate it. You've seen Carl Maston's office. He located some of this Los Angeles brick at the time he was building the office, and he picked up seconds and then turned the brick around and used the rear or the face that would normally be hidden within the wall. He used that as the finished surface, so that frankly the Los Angeles brick industry has a long distance to go to match the kind of quality that's available elsewhere. By the way, I didn't show this, and you're welcome to come up and see some of these things afterwards. This is a sand mold brick, Port Costa. It's a brick that is poured in liquid form into a mold, and the sand tends to allow the brick to be loose and be removed. It also gives a fine texture to the finished product. There's a hand quality that's achieved in this particular type of fabrication process. Getting back to this brick, it was very carefully selected to suit its relationship to concrete. There was no Los Angeles brick, a standard brick, that would have done the job in this particular case. Here you see the relationship of the paving brick to the wall brick, and I think the simplicity of the relationship here is quite important to the composition. Also, I think of interest is the fact that we tried to separate the brick and the concrete where they came in relationship to one another, and it creates an articulation that has sort of, for me, it's sort of a mysterious quality, touching yet not touching. Here's a picture of the texture of the concrete. where we used a board form with a resawn lumber, a rotary cut, and with very little patching done after the forms were removed. Now, that's not too clear, but that shows one of the tie holes that was also expressed throughout the building and filled with a small cement cap that covers over the rough opening. This is a detail of the brick and the concrete. Of course, there are various methods of laying brick. This demonstrates a roll-out course at the base, which tends to develop a starting course, a finishing course in a sense also, in relationship to the floor. Here's a detail of the glass penetrating into the side of the brick wall without heavy detailing. It worked out very successfully here. This is a reflection of the brick and the concrete through the glass doors, or from the glass doors. And here we have the brick penetrating into the lobby areas as well as the concrete. I like to use wood. In this case, we use redwood on the ceiling areas and oak on the vertical panels. And this had to do with the fire code, which would not allow oak on the ceiling, and the durability of redwood if used on a wall surface. It's it's softer and would scar more easily than oak. This is a view from a small vestibule that leads to the small viewing theaters in the four corners of the ground floor. One of the theaters within the building. The corridor upstairs, and a typical office. This is one of the buildings that Ray mentioned back in Middle West. This is at the University of Michigan. It's a basketball arena. And here we, again, it's basically a concrete building. And in the intermediate space, we have enclosed a major portion of the area with a masonry wall. In this case, it's a brick exterior course. On the inside, we have a backup block wall. Now, this is a very common procedure back east, but is not one that's used on the West Coast. Basically, because of the reinforcement techniques here, masonry is generally reinforced and grouted in Southern California to withstand earthquake stresses. In this location, we don't have the seismic problem, and masonry walls can be constructed without reinforcement, and this is an economical way of constructing a non-reinforced wall. This is the rear entrance to the facility. That railing, the top of the railing is a 12-inch round pipe. Here you can see the inside concourse and the exposed backup concrete block coursing. That was used that way really for economic reasons. The building was built at a very low budget, so that given my druthers, I would have had used the face brick on the inside also. The brick on this building is a salt glaze brick. It's a very durable, hard finish with some textures from metallic bits that are included within the original clay, and during the firing they fuse into little pellets of metal and add its own unique texture to the surface of patina. This is Great Western Financial in Long Beach. Here we used a bearing grouted masonry exterior wall with concrete bond beam at the top, as well as header beams at various openings. There's another view of the exterior. The actual color of the brick is somewhere between these two pictures. It's not quite as red as this and not quite as brown as the other. Here we have a building that is designed with a 6.5-foot thick space on the exterior wall. And we've penetrated that space from the outside at points and also recessed areas from the inside so that the space becomes a very dynamic space rather than just a simple enclosing wall. We have also cut into the form in a way that allows light to penetrate the building in various unusual ways with varying intensities. And the inside, which you'll see later, reflects that variety of light quality that you can achieve by creating a wall system that is not just a series of simple openings in a thin system. We also have 3 large skylights that allow light to enter indirectly and reflect off of teak surfaces. Here again you can see the penetrations, angular penetrations into the inside surface of this 6.5-foot space. In locations we've brought the glass, as you see on that upper band above the brick, we've brought the glass out to the surface, and it in a sense becomes a solidified portion when the light reflects on it, solidified portion of the surface mass, as you can see clearly on this photograph. By the way, let me show you something that I wasn't too happy with on this building. This joint is a continuous joint. It's an angle wider than 90 degrees, and if we had the chance to do this over again, I would suggest that we cut these bricks so that the corners are solid and the joints occur on either side. This can be done with a saw on the site or pre-sawn at the factory. Here you can see the quality of light on the interior, where the light reflects off of these angular surfaces as well as penetrate directly through the glass. I remember a presentation that Louis Kahn made where he discussed primary light and secondary light and tertiary light and so forth, that it depends how many times light is reflected before it reaches your eye. And with this kind of system, we have that kind of interplay of the various types of light. We used a quarry tile floor, and as I said, quarry tile is a pressed material generally. Very dense clay surface. Very fine clays are used for quarry tile. This is the stadium design at UCLA. The only place where we used brick on this project is on a paving course around the building. Here we used it in a limited fashion because of budget limitations. If I had this to do over again, I would have paved the entire concourse in brick. but that it was strictly a matter of budget at the time. You can see a small amount of that brick on the concourse here. Again, I think it tends to add a warmth of color, a warmth of texture, and of the scale of the brick itself adds a human quality to a building. This is a Stephen Weiss temple, which is basic, you know, an all-brick building, basically. And here we used a Hancock brick that was custom-made for the project. It's a Norman-sized brick. I didn't mention before, the bricks come in various sizes. There's what they call a common brick size, and this can vary in locations and vary between manufacturers. It's basically an 8-inch wide brick and 2 1/4 inches high, and I think 3 3/4 inches deep. The Norman brick is approximately the same height and depth, but is more modular in that it's 11 1/2 inches wide. We use the modular brick here. It's less expensive to lay than the common brick because fewer units make up a square foot, so there's less labor involved. It's hard to see some of the details here, but we used a redwood, naturally finished redwood ceiling. It's a massive form with deep penetrations through the form, and here again we developed that the two types of light, the light that comes in directly and lights the courtyard below, and this shows it more clearly for you, and the light that reflects off of the surfaces, not only the upper surfaces, but you get light reflecting on the sidewalk and reflecting upward onto the brick walls. I have a thing about joints in brickwork. There are a number of ways of finishing a joint. Many people seem to favor a rake joint, but I do not personally like a rake joint. I think it's a rake joint means after you finish the wall, you route out a portion of the brick wall, exposing the surface or the form of the brick more clearly in the shade and shadow of the light that's hitting it. But to me, it tends to weaken the massive nature of and the texture of the wall, and it's technically bad. I get some applause here. It's technically bad because it allows moisture to penetrate the wall more easily, and that's something that you have to be very careful about. Not only moisture penetrating the surface of the wall, but you have to be concerned about moisture penetrating the top surface of a wall, which I haven't discussed yet, but this is a very important technical aspect of brick masonry. As you see here, this wall is protected at the coping by a metallic flashing. This prevents the water from penetrating through the wall. The water will tend to come through the wall and wander all the way through and pop out in various locations within the interior of the building, and can be a major problem. Also, as the water does move through the brick, it picks up salts, and there's a tendency for efflorescence to occur, which is a white streaking that you've seen, I'm sure, on a number of buildings. Efflorescence. This is salt that is dissolved into the water and then comes out, and when the water dries on the surface, it leaves the salt on the surface of the brick. Here's a building, savings and loan that we did. also using brick and concrete. Another thing that you should be concerned about in the coursing of brick, common brick with its 8-inch dimension allows for a common bond where the bricks, the joints line up in the center line of the course below, center line of the brick in the bricks in the course below. In Norman brick, the tendency is to develop a bonding. I don't know if you can see it from here. A bonding whereby the brick above the course below laps only approximately a third of the brick. And there's a specific aesthetic difference in viewing a wall. And you have to keep this in mind when specifying brick or designing with brick to determine what type of feel you want. Here's the use of the flash brick, taking the common brick. As I said before, in the manufacture process, smoke is added to the kiln, and depending on where the brick is in the kiln, it will receive varying amounts of this flashing process. And so the colors will vary from brick to brick. And I have used this a great deal on Nibbler's Restaurant and Thrifty's and a number of other projects. And I find it to give the brick a softer, warmer color than utilizing the raw face brick that's available in Southern California. Here you can see the variety of colors. In this particular building, instead of taking the brick directly from the manufacturer as it came out of the kiln, we selected the very darks and the very lights and generally turned those bricks inward so that the surfaces weren't exposed, so that this is more of the mid-range of the flash brick that's available. This is a Higgins brick. Here we used again for detailing purposes, a header course, a soldier course on the base and a roll-out course as a cap for this freestanding wall. We started again with a header course, a soldier course at this point. We used the soldier course to emphasize the span on the upper portion of this, the opening for the sign. Of course, using reinforced masonry walls, we're able to span with masonry in a similar way as we span with concrete. And even though it, from an aesthetic standpoint, it tends to look weak, it really isn't. So oftentimes we'll use concrete to span openings because of the just the aesthetic feeling that a brick span of this nature doesn't look as strong as it would otherwise. But then there are times where we feel that that the brick should stand alone, as in this case, where the penetration in the building for the sign was occurs in the brick and should not be disturbed with a concrete header beam. This is a building in Orange County, basically concrete, utilizing some of these same techniques which are necessary in the construction process, but by emphasizing them, we develop a texture and a fabric that relates more to the human scale and to the way the building is, expressing the way the building is constructed. In this case, this is a post-tension concrete structure where the floor systems were post-tension, and the floors were expressed here where the rods were pulled, and then the jagged holes, irregular spacing of the holes were covered, in this case with a thin coat of cement to blend it into a simple band. Here you can see we used a very fine-looking paver on the entry walks. This is pebbles that surround the base of the building in relationship to the texture. We carried the brick up the steps into the building. This is teak wood, which weathers similarly to redwood on the exterior. So we brought the teak on the outside and brought it into the inside of the building also. Here you can see a effect of flashing on a brick, and the way the brick is stacked in the kiln affects the pattern of the flashing. You can see that in this case a brick probably covered half of this particular unit in the kiln, while this half was more exposed for the penetration of the smoke. Here is the use of, it's not a very good photograph, but we used the brick, carried it right into the elevator in this case. This is little public relations here. These are some of the buildings we're doing. This Theater Arts building at Dominguez Hills State College. This is the final concept that is being constructed now. And this is a building out at Northridge. Here, unfortunately, in fact, the brick that I showed, the face brick that I showed you, the light orange brick, is standard for this particular campus. I personally don't like it, but we were stuck with it, and I think it's unfortunate that we have to use some of these colors. Here's a building we're doing for the post office. Post office in Redondo Beach. It's interesting that the post office has very tight regulations. The federal government in general has very tight regulations with respect to designing buildings. And here we had a very unusual situation occur in that the old post office in Redondo Beach had some murals that were painted in the during the 30s, WPA murals. And they were preserved when the old post office was destroyed. And we were able to design our building and the entry lobby around the concept of preserving and installing these existing murals. And even though the post office representatives were very reluctant to deviate from their standards, we kept bringing up the fact that we have these murals and we have to design the building to suit the murals and so on. And it gave us a wedge to develop a building that I think will be one of our better structures. Here we're using a local product, the medium brown Pacific Clay Products brick, which is, I feel, one of their better colors. This is a building we're working on at UCLA. Basically, it's a concrete building with some brick on the entry walks, and then the roof terrace will be eventually a paver brick. And this is a building that's under construction at UCLA. It's a very interesting structure. It's the parking and entry facility for the major health sciences center. And here the parking structure is terraced upward, relating to the existing topography terraced upward in 5-foot increments to the level of the main entry, and this would be a new entry structure at this point in front of the existing lobby. We penetrated the structure periodically with light wells that penetrate through the entire building, providing light and air and a pleasant atmosphere to the interior of what could be a very dark and dingy kind of structure. We're trying to make the parking structure more human, or more human environment. Yes?
I noticed that the Jerry Lewis building, the work that we're seeing goes pretty freely between, say, concrete, masonry, and a combination of both. How would you decide, say, at the Jerry Lewis building, for instance, to go concrete, to play down the masonry part as opposed to the other way?
Well, in the case of the Jerry Lewis building, the existing masonry of the Health Sciences Center, in my opinion, is not that attractive. And there's tremendous quantities of it. It's a medley of these peach rose-colored brick. And if we put a small building if we designed it in masonry, it would be difficult to justify going to a special color masonry at that point. And we might have been forced to use the existing UCLA standards. So one of the reasons we went to concrete was to avoid that issue. Second reason relates to what's going on in this structure, which will all be exposed concrete, and various other lower elements within the campus area that are in concrete. And so we felt that there was justification to use concrete because of those reasons. And also the kind of spanning that was involved and so forth. It works better as a concrete building, I feel, aesthetically than a brick building. This is a model of the entry structure on the top deck of the parking facility. This top deck, let me go back. This top deck will be a landscape pedestrian terrace, even though it shows a car at this point. This was debated at university circles for some time, but it's now definitely all pedestrian and with a sunken landscape terrace here. And the entire deck hopefully will be a paving brick. And this leads into this structure, which will have the paving brick throughout the floor areas, and this will all be concrete. This is a sawtooth skylight system supported by, I think they're 8.5-inch round steel tubes that are supported on either side, top and bottom of the sawtooth. This is a building that was completed recently, the Victory Park Recreation Center. And here again we use the flashed common brick. Basically the building was designed for face brick, but because of budgetary reasons we went to common brick. As it turned out, I think we could have gotten the face brick because the cost of the building came in lower than was estimated. But it's reasonably handsome with the common brick. It's an interesting little situation that came up on the side of this building. During the course of constructing this, the contractor left openings in the brick wall to insert their large laminated beams that span the gymnasium. And then once the beams were in place, these holes were then patched with the supposedly the same brick, but sometimes brick will often vary from run to run, and the brick that was used to patch these areas was lighter than the brick used for the main wall. So we complained about this and wanted them to replace the brick, and then they said, well, they would, there's a way of staining the brick so that it would tend to blend. So after many discussions and arguments and so forth, it was decided, well, we'll try the staining process. So they went, they got up on scaffolds or ladders and did the staining. And I was out at the, to view the building at the opening. And what they had done, it was, you wouldn't believe it, they had stained this section here, they had stained this section here, but the workman, when he went to stain this beam, up on the ladder, I guess he got mixed up, and he stained the panel next to the panel that was supposed to be stained. So when you go out there, you see the existing lighter band of brick adjacent to a new darker stained panel of brick. So he just complicated the situation even further. Right. It's one of those things that happens, you just don't believe it on a job.
You talk to that in relationship to detail, though, Dan. I think, you know, had that become known to you as a construction system, maybe you could, instead of worrying about, you know, knowing that the potential for color would be there, maybe just expressing the fact that
express the beam end
came in there, or the beam ends, or even a recessed brick, so that you would throw the shadow or whatever would happen and break it off.
It could have been done. Actually, we didn't.
You probably didn't know he was going to build it that way.
Yeah, we didn't really think of that in the course of designing it, or didn't know whether that would be the way it would be constructed. And then during construction, you know, you have to think fast, which we didn't. But unfortunately, that occurred.
There was nothing special on your brick, was there? I mean,
no, in this case, the radius is wide enough so that we used the standard brick. It wasn't a special brick. But, what? Well, yeah, brick, I mean, brick can be formed. It's a mud, and it can be formed in any reasonable shape. And it can be formed with a radius if specially ordered. Some materials come with a radius. For instance, there are concrete block units that are available on with a radius. And in this case, it's a series of segments. I don't know, but flat segments that combine develop a circle.
Would you say to keep using, in order to use commons?
Oh.
Do you have any idea?
I know that let's go back here. This wall came out reasonably well, and I would guess that the radius is at least 12 feet or something of that nature. This wall is right on the borderline using the heavy elements that we've got here. This also depends on the size of the unit. In this case, we're using a 11.5-inch long brick, and the radius would have to be longer for this type of brick versus an 8-inch brick, where you have smaller units to make your curve. On this particular wall, which I think the radius is probably 8 feet, approximately 8 feet, it's starting to break down a little bit. You get, you can't see it there. In certain light, you start seeing the details of the bricks turning, and it isn't quite as attractive as the wider radius. So that depends on the size brick that you're using. This is this building is a series of 3 small meeting rooms, activity rooms, adjacent to a larger gymnasium, and the space between is used as an access to the rooms as well as an activity space in itself. The roof is penetrated in many locations, and we also developed a skylight over the main entry to the gymnasium. And this I just put in because we recently completed the building. It's a warehouse office structure where the office is separated completely from the warehouse and connected by basically a glass link to the rectangular tilt-up concrete facility. Here we use that same dark brown paver, flash paver. I just thought I'd show our office staff. That's it. Oops. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Some rural people use, well, 12-inch long brick, use 12-foot radius, not less than that. 8-inch brick will use less than 8-foot radius. And to make a rake joint, that's an undesirable thing. You can get a little bit less disturbance because you can't see that this edge doesn't line up with the other edge.
By the way, the type of joint that I like to use is a tool joint, which is achieved by using a round pipe-like tool and pressing the mortar into the joint. It tends to finish off the joint aesthetically well, but it also creates a more watertight and sound structural joint than any other approach to finishing a joint. Well, you can strike the joint flush, and this is also attractive with respect to developing a very solid looking uniform quality over the surface of the wall, and can be quite attractive if the joint and the brick are of the same color. But there's a tendency for that joint to be open from the standpoint of water seepage, as well as the joint being loose and possibly chipping away in time. Then there are other types of joints I could possibly demonstrate it in a piece of paper, but there are struck joints, and you can do anything you want to with that joint with various tools. You can press in a tool that develops a V groove that's deeper than what would be achieved with a pipe, and of course you can use various radius pipe to create your that indented tooled surface. I think that covers the basic joints used here.
For a minute about waterproofing, what kinds of problems do you confront with in terms of using masonry as a solid panel or as an exterior partition system? And what do you have to do to make sure that water doesn't seep through?
Well, we generally use a silicone type waterproofing application after the wall has been completed. First of all, depending on the brick that we're using, we will attempt to clean the surface as much as possible, and often we'll use a sandblasting technique to clean the brick. And then immediately after that, we will apply a waterproofing coating so as the brick will not absorb water. If the brick absorbs water, there's a tendency for that water then to evaporate outward to the surface and deposit the salts that it has dissolved when the water's within the brick wall, or the salts that are in the water initially. So the waterproofing does prevent that, and also it prevents potential leaking through the entire wall into the inner surface. And I would recommend waterproofing brick. Is the brick economic? Well, in relationship to what is the question. In terms of analyzing various systems for the construction of a building, there are limitations as to code. For instance, certain fire zones, certain types of buildings in terms of occupancy, and certain and buildings are rated in terms of size and height. And so if a building has to be a masonry, or it has to be a fireproof building, we then will select from a number of available materials, one of which is brick. The other is concrete. A third would be steel fireproofed with either concrete or brick, or layers of plaster or gunite. So within the vocabulary of fireproof wall systems, brick is one of the economical systems to use. And then again, brick walls can vary in cost depending on whether you're using common brick, flash common brick, special kinds of common brick that are available, and then face brick in various qualities. I did bring along some samples of, this is a material that we've been using quite a bit of. It's from Nebraska, Endicott Brick. We're using the Endicott pavers a great deal in the Los Angeles area now. But this particular board shows 4 different types of brick. This is more of that salt glaze finish that I was talking about, and if you look closely, you see the little iron spots, or metallic spots, I assume they're iron, on the surface. And it's a very dense, vitrified surface. Here is a brick that has a superimposed textural finish, which I personally would never use. I think that this tends to destroy the quality of the brick that it's covering. Here's another a salt glaze type of finish, very hard surface in a dark tone. This is a brick, I don't know what they've done to it, but basically they've scarred the brick. Very often you'll see this, not so much in this area, but back east, and it will look very artificial when you see an entire wall with a series of indentations. What they'll do is they'll take the brick and just hit it with whatever they've got in their hand, but and this will give it an antique quality. In this case, they've applied some sort of chemical to the surface or sand finish to give it a special color quality. Right. There are various ways to scar. Sometimes the brick can be scarred or finished very expertly, so that it does have an unusually, an unusual quality that might be desirable. But Most brick that is specially treated of that nature tends to look a little hokey. Here's the Endicott pavers, which we've been using, which I think are some of the nicer pavers available in this area now. And they are being shipped in from out of state. I mentioned this is the sand mold brick. You'll see a great deal of this in San Francisco. There's a soft quality. The edges are softer and less machine in quality. Plus the fact that it does have a sand exterior finish. You can see here that the way the bricks are stacked in the kiln develops a pattern on the brick. Sometimes these can get very contrasting, and I think can be detrimental in terms of the overall color quality of a wall. Here's a, oops, this is Major Brick Company of, where are they from? I think in Texas. Is that right? Doesn't say here. Yeah, Henderson, Texas. But you can see here, this is, look at the range of colors from one brick company in Texas as compared to the colors that we have available here. It's sort of frightening that we really don't have the selections that they do elsewhere in the country. Plus the kind of surface quality that you get from the natural wire finish, wire cut finish. It's called also a velour finish in certain areas. But it's, I think it's the most attractive kind of finish for brick, and there's so much subtlety that you can create with some of these very earthy tones versus the versus this type of look. It's hard to use other colors when you start with a color as pronounced as this. I think that more or less winds up my presentation, unless you have more questions. It does. Basically, the texture that's superimposed, though, is a natural one that relates to the function of developing the wall. So I think that it's an acceptable texture. I think when you sandblast it too much, the sandblasting aspects of it over-emphasize that part of the process of building the wall. But the fact that it does clean mortar and other debris that may stick to the surface, I think is beneficial to cleaning up the wall. And oftentimes the sandblasting will bring a little more color out of the brick than what was there in the initial surface. So that, if that's desirable, then the sandblasting should be used. It does. It tends to increase that porosity.